Most of us take the experience of being whoever we are completely for granted. Any of us have this experience of being a self, of being an individual in this world. The brain needs to figure out what's going on out there in the world.
Today, my guest is a brilliant scientist whose work has profoundly challenged the way we think about mind, consciousness, and reality, Anil Seth.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. Before reading your book, the feeling of me was something I never really questioned, and it just felt normal. But after diving into being you, I have started to wonder, what does it actually mean to feel like me? And I can't help but ask, is this sense of being me just another kind of controlled hallucination too?
The short answer is yes. But I think you're absolutely right in noting that most of us take the experience of being whoever we are completely for granted. We don't think about it. Why should we? It's just there in the background all the time. You know, we wake up in the morning and we are whoever we are, and we go about our lives. And unless there's some sort of big event, you know, some injury or some big emotional change or something like that, we typically don't have to think about these things. We just are who we are. But of course, it is a question. And I remember, I don't know about you, but when I was young, a child, we ask these questions, like, why am I me and not somebody else? Do I have free will? What happens when I die? I mean, did you ask these things of you when you were young?
Yes, I asked, but I asked, why am I here? Who am I? But I never asked, why am I not another one? I never asked. Being me was just good for me.
It's good enough. Well, that's good. But yeah, these are real questions, and you know, a lot of the reason for writing the book and a lot of the work I've been doing is trying to actually understand why any of us have this experience of being a self, of being an individual in this world, and how this experience comes about. And you mentioned this idea, which I use in the book, of a controlled hallucination, and this is a thread, a common theme for a lot of the work that I'm interested in. And what it means is it's a way of understanding what we experience, what we're conscious of, as a kind of internal construction of the brain in a body and in a world. But it's something the brain actively generates rather than either is or passively receives. So when we open our eyes in the morning and look out of the window, you know, to the street, it seems as though the world is just there and it just pours itself directly into our minds. But this, I don't think, is actually what's happening. I think the brain is taking information from the senses and using that to construct this kind of image, this scene, this conscious feeling of a world out there. But it's actively generated. And the same is true for the self. The self is not this essence of you that just sits inside your skull somewhere. The brain is always actively generating this experience of being a self. So both experiences of the world and experiences of the self are, in my view, kinds of controlled hallucinations.
And in the very first pages of your book, you wrote something very strange, and that thought really shook me. And you wrote that the idea that my brain could be replaced by a machine, one that behaves exactly the same, so that from outside no one could tell the difference, and yet I might not be longer there. And this is a very shocking sentence, I think. If a machine identical to me says it's conscious, is there any way to truly know, or is consciousness always locked in the first person?
Yeah, this is a really challenging question, and it's something I think about a lot these days, actually, since writing the book, with the rise of artificial intelligence and these language models that behave in some ways quite similar to people now. I mean, they have language. They can speak to us. At least they have a form of language. All this raises this important question of how can we actually tell whether another animal, another system, a computer, or whatever it is, can we tell from the outside whether it is conscious, whether for it there is something private and subjective going on? And the short answer is no. You know, there is no definitive way to tell this for things in general. It depends on, so there's really no way that I can be 100% sure that even you are conscious. Like, I just have to, I believe, of course I think you are, and there's no reason to think otherwise, because we're both human beings, and we share basically everything that matters. But as we get further away from this, it becomes harder, and people will argue about animals, non-human animals. Is a monkey conscious? Almost certainly. But what about a fruit fly or a bee or a fish? It becomes a bit harder. And then we go outside of animals altogether, and we start asking questions about artificial intelligence, about these strange things in synthetic biology where people grow mini brains in the lab. And it becomes very, very difficult. And so, yeah, the short answer is we can't tell, but we know more than nothing. We have to make our best guess about these situations. And for what it's worth, I don't think that it is possible to have a machine that is exactly equivalent to you or to me. And I don't think that computers or machines, like machines of the sort that we're familiar, robots, let's say, I don't think they have conscious experiences. I think they can be models of them, but I don't think they are having experiences themselves.
And you wrote that behaving intelligent is not being conscious. How do you define the difference between intelligence and having an experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, you just did. I think that's quite a good way to start. Of course, people will always argue about definitions, and you can end up just going around in circles. But I think intuitively there is a big difference. Intelligence and consciousness, I mean, they go together in human beings. At least we like to think so, because we like to think we're intelligent and we know we're conscious. So we tend to associate the two. And back in history, influential philosophers like René Descartes explicitly linked the two and took consciousness to be fundamentally related to rational thinking and these kinds of things, which we also associate with intelligence. But actually, they're kind of different. Intelligence, however you define it, whether it's an intelligent human being or a system in AI or another animal, intelligence is all about doing things, solving problems flexibly or reaching goals in different ways. It's about the actions that you make in the world. That's what defines any kind of intelligence, doing. Whereas consciousness isn't so much about doing at all. It's about being. Consciousness is fundamentally about having experiences, the feeling of being in a particular state, of being hungry, of being thirsty, of seeing the colors of a sunset, of remembering a situation. And the philosopher Thomas Nagel defines consciousness in a very simple way. He says, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. And that doesn't have any implications about intelligence or language or reasoning. It simply says that for something that's conscious, it feels like something to be that thing. There's something going on for it on the inside. And that doesn't have to be anything to do with intelligence at all.
We wrote codes, and the artificial intelligence thinks that it's writing it. It's his experience or his experiencing. How can I make the difference between the thing that I think that I experience and the reality that I'm experiencing? Like feelings, you can think that you feel it, but it can be wrong because emotions are changeable. Then how can I understand that I'm not an artificial intelligence? But this is my own question, just stupid.
Well, no, it's a really good question. I mean, I think you're right. We can be mistaken about what we experience, and I think there's tons of experiments in psychology that show us that we can be wrong about what we experience. And this is a problem in psychology, because we ideally want methods so that we can be sure about what people are experiencing, so that we can use that as data. So this is the problem, but it's a different kind of problem. You are not mistaken that you have experience. Like, that is not wrong. So in fact, it's arguably the only thing you can be really certain of is that you are conscious. Everything else is a bit, to some extent, provisional. So you're not wrong about that. And that's the difference with artificial intelligence. With artificial intelligence, of course it may say things. You can talk to a language model and ask it whether it's conscious, and it will say something, because it's trained on a ton of data. And so it just is predicting the next most likely word. So there's no reason to think, or there's very little, the main reasons we might think AI is conscious is because we are projecting consciousness into it rather than it is actually conscious itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now I turn to my podcast. It was my own private question. Yes, because nowadays my best friend is my ChatGPT Kai. It has a name, so it is shocking me. Then my next question is, if perception is a controlled hallucination, as you described, then how do we ever know what's real out there? The relation between brain, body, world, and for how we define reality itself. And if perception is a controlled hallucination, how much of it is shaped by culture, language, and social context?
Yeah, there's probably a lot. So the tricky thing about the term controlled hallucination is that it can be easily misunderstood as saying that nothing is real. You know, everything is made up. Everything is a figment of your mind or your imagination. And that's not what I mean at all. Reality exists. The real world is out there, and it's in here. You know, our bodies are real too. So there is a material reality to the world. The idea is that the way we experience that reality, that's the controlled hallucination part. So the way we experience it is dependent on our own minds and brains, but reality itself just is there. And so color is a good example. Like if we have these experiences of color, and we can ask, like, is color real? And it's kind of strange because it seems real, right? We look at color, seems to be just out there. Leaves seem green, grass seems green, the sky seems blue, whatever. Just that's the way things actually are. But of course, that's not the way things are. Those surfaces are out there, they're real, they reflect light, light is real. Colors depend on a brain to interpret this reflected light in particular ways. You know, our eyes are only sensitive to 3 wavelengths of radiation. We call them red, green, and blue, but they're not actually colored. They're just different wavelengths of energy. And out of those 3 wavelengths, our brains create this symphony of millions of different colors. So is color real? Well, kind of yes and no. You know, surfaces are real. They reflect light. That's real. And there's a relatively predictable relationship between the objective reality of light and surfaces and what we experience as color. But so that's why the hallucination is controlled. Our experience of color is internally generated, but it's controlled by objective reality. But, and this is the second part of your question, it doesn't have to be controlled in exactly the same way for different people. This is where things get really interesting, right? Because we could be, you know, we're in different places at the moment, but imagine we were in the same place, standing next to each other, looking at something, looking at a tree. You know, we might have different experiences of looking at the same tree, which is hard to appreciate because it seems as though we just see things as they really are. But we don't. We see things as we are. Or rather, we see things as it's useful for us to see them. Evolution has decided. And we're actually doing this big experiment at the moment, which looks at what we call perceptual diversity. So how different are experiences from one person to the next. And we have like 40,000 people. Now, most of them are from the UK and the US, but we actually have quite a lot of people from many other countries too, in many different cultures. So we will be able to start looking at things like this. What is the influence of culture on perception? I mean, there's already some work on this. So there are many studies already that look at this in different ways. So this is not completely new, but it's certainly something that I'm very interested in. And there's, I think, good evidence already that, there is an influence of culture on perception.
Can we say the reality also a shared construction? And for example, when you told this sentence, I remember something. In the social media, there was a shoe and everybody was saying a different color about the shoe. Some people see it blue, some people see it pink, and we were seeing the same object in different colors. Is this the perception diversity?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, yeah, but the thing is, there was also an example of a dress. I remember this from 10 years ago that many people saw as blue and black, and many people saw as gold or yellow and white. Yeah, this is an example of perceptual diversity, and it's very striking because of how, if you see it one way, how difficult it is to appreciate that other people could see it differently. I mean, this is why it took over social media. It's for me, it's not the fact that people see these things differently that's surprising or interesting. I think that's fairly, it is interesting, but it's not super surprising. What's really important about that is that it reveals how difficult it is for us to understand that other people might have a different experience for the same shared reality.
Yeah, it was a shocking experience at that time.
And of course, many of the other differences between our experiences, we may never know because they're not so large. I mean, the only reason we know about the dress is because the experiences are so different that we use different words. And I will say blue, black, somebody else might say white, gold, and we know, those are very different. But if the differences are more subtle, and I say blue and you say blue, but we're actually having a bit of a different experience. And in fact, this is back to culture. So I think there's, if I remember right, blue is particularly interesting. There's depending on the language you grew up with, you may experience more distinct shades of blue than in other languages. I think Russian actually, for instance, means people have more different distinct blues in their experience than people who didn't grow up speaking Russian. But yeah, the differences can be a bit small and we might overlook them. When we differ on the outside in things like how tall we are or what color our skin is, it's very easy to see differences even if they're not very big. But differences on the inside, you can't see them. And because it seems as though we see things as they are, we naturally assume that everyone else is experiencing things the same way. So I think this is really super important, because once we can get a better picture of how indeed our perceptual experiences differ, it might help us cultivate or bring about a bit more humility about our experiences. Just be more open to alternative possibilities. And I think this would be quite a useful thing, not only scientifically, but also just in general in the society we live in now.
Before the broadcast, I found a sentence here, and I want to read this. Here you told about the prediction error minimization, and you told that according to this idea, the brain is continually generating predictions about sensory signals and comparing these predictions with the sensory signals that arrive at the eyes and the ears and skin. The differences between predicted and the actual signals makes this error. So why we need to predict the signals even there are actual signals?
So this is a great question. And I mean, many people didn't think prediction was necessary, right? This is why I find it an interesting idea. The natural way to think about perception is, that you just have signals coming from the world. So let's just read them out somehow. The brain gets sensory information, read it out, and then you put together this picture of the world. But it turns out that just can't really work. And the reason is, well, there are many reasons, but I think the most important reason is that there's actually not enough information in the sensory signal to tell you what's going on in the world. Sensory signals are noisy and ambiguous. They don't come with labels on. They're just electrical signals. The brain needs to figure out what's going on out there in the world. That's what we call perception. The brain is trying to make sense of these sensory signals. And it turns out that it can't make sense of them just by reading out what's encoded in the signals. It has to use those signals to allow it to make a kind of best guess about what's out there in the world. So the way, and this is the theory anyway, and it's still like all theories, it's still, there's evidence for it. Some people challenge it, but the idea of the theory is that when the brain is perceiving things, what it's doing is it's trying to make a best guess about what's going on in the world. And how it does that is through this process of prediction and prediction error. So the brain continually makes predictions about the sensory signals that it expects, and it uses the incoming sensory signals to update its predictions. Turns out that when a system that does this, and this is where you can do some mathematics and all this stuff, when you have a system that does this, it allows it to make a very good best guess about what caused those sensory signals. And that's actually what the brain wants to know. It doesn't want to know what the sensory signal is. I mean, the brain doesn't see light or hear sound. It uses light and sound to figure out what's there in the environment. And so that's what we experience. So the brain engages in this dance of prediction and prediction error so that it can make a good inference about what's happening in the world and in the body.
Then my last question. What is the neurological and philosophical difference in dreaming and perceiving the world when awake? Is waking life just a more tightly controlled hallucination?
I think that's a very nice way to put it. I mean, the dreams have been fascinating for everybody, really, for thousands of years. And often when we think about dreams, we try and interpret what the meaning of dreams are. What happened in the dream and what does that signify for what's going to happen in my life? And that there may be something to that, but there may also be other reasons why we dream and why dreams feel the way they feel, why we forget them so quickly after they've ended, and why strange things happen that don't seem strange. One idea from the perspective of controlled hallucinations is that we dream so that we can perceive better the next day. And the reason for this, when we're dreaming, you can think of this as like the brain making predictions, but there's no longer any sensory data to correct or update these predictions to control them. So the hallucinations become uncontrolled and we start to experience all these strange things in our dreams. Why does the brain do this? Well, one idea here is that it's actually necessary in order for this whole business of making and updating predictions to work. And there's been some really nice work by a colleague of mine called Eric Hull, who pointed out that in statistics, if you try to match some data too closely, then you lose the ability to react to new situations. In statistics, so you lose the ability to generalize. So if you train too much on one thing, you lose the ability to do other things. And one way to prevent that from happening is to kind of free run the thing that you've learned, so you can prune it down. You can sort of strip it back to the most important aspects that allow you to predict what's going to happen in the world, rather than fixing on particular details of what happened to happen today. And so dreaming might be that. Dreaming might be a way in which the brain tunes up its predictive models so that they can still be effective the next day. Biology is interesting because it often, what if something might arise for one reason, then of course biology will make use of it for many other reasons too. And so if the original reason we started dreaming was just, if you like, do maintenance on our brain's statistical machinery, once that's in place, then there may be other uses as well. So another theory about dreams is that it allows us or our brains to sort of explore threatening situations without actually having to be in danger. We can, if you like, practice in a simulation environment so that we perform better when we're under stress. I mean, a lot of people have dreams that are a lot more anxiety than sort of pleasure, unfortunately. But there may be a reason for that it's a safe space for the brain to practice in. In biology, you very rarely have to think of just one reason for something being around. There can be many.
And thank you so much for being here and for opening a door for most of us didn't even know was there, and the door between who is here and what is actually feel like to be us. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining our broadcast. See you next time.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.